This is a story about two elections, one happening in the streets of Mogadishu, and one happening in the corridors of power in Washington. In Somalia, citizens are taking a fragile historic step toward democracy. But in America, a leaked diplomatic memo reveals a Trump administration official telling staff to aggressively remind Africans of American generosity, even as that same administration slashes aid. Is this a cynical PR move or a legitimate reset in foreign policy? And what does it mean for Kenya and the entire continent? Some say it's a necessary dose of reality. Others call it patronizing and racist. Who's right? To understand the tension, we need to set the stage. First, Somalia. For decades, the Horn of Africa nation has been synonymous with conflict, famine, and statelessness. The concept of one person, one vote has been a distant dream since the collapse of the central government in 1991. Governance has been managed through complex clan-based power-sharing agreements, and at times, indirect elections where parliamentarians were chosen by elders. The vote we're seeing now in the capital's districts is a pilot, a first tentative step toward a direct national election promised for later this decade. It's a monumental undertaking, supported by the UN and international partners, aimed at building legitimate, grassroots political legitimacy. Now, pivot to Washington. Since President Trump's inauguration for his second term in January 2025, his administration has pursued a pronounced America First foreign policy. This has included a significant restructuring and reduction of traditional foreign aid, with a focus on direct, transactional partnerships and a skepticism of multilateral institutions. The U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, has seen its footprint and budgets shrink under this new direction. Into this environment steps a new political appointee leading the State Department's Bureau of African Affairs. This past January, just days ago, this official sent an internal email to diplomatic staff across the continent. That email, obtained by The Guardian, is the spark for our debate today. It instructs diplomats to unabashedly and aggressively remind African governments of the generosity of the American people in past efforts, like containing HIV/AIDS and alleviating famine. The central tension is clear. As Somalia tries to build a future with less certain international support, the primary donor from the past is redefining and loudly marketing its role. Let's start with the perspective of the Trump administration and supporters of this new diplomatic directive. Proponents argue this is not about being gauche, as the email dismisses that notion, but about strategic clarity and honest accounting. Supporters point out that for decades, the United States has been the world's largest donor of humanitarian and development aid to Africa, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into health initiatives like PEPFAR, which is credited with saving over 25 million lives, and into emergency famine relief. They argue that this immense contribution is often taken for granted, or, worse, criticized by recipient governments and global commentators. The administration's position is that the era of blank check diplomacy is over. The new approach demands mutual respect and reciprocal partnerships. From this viewpoint, reminding partners of past generosity is a way to establish a baseline of goodwill and shared history before negotiating future engagements that must be more explicitly beneficial to U.S. interests. Furthermore, they argue this is about combating misinformation and negative narratives. In an era of great power competition, with China and Russia actively expanding their influence in Africa through loans, infrastructure deals, and diplomatic outreach, the U.S. feels its legacy is being erased or overshadowed. This directive, supporters say, is a necessary communications strategy to ensure African leaders and publics remember who stood with them during their darkest hours, fighting the HIV pandemic, stopping Ebola, and delivering food during droughts. It's about claiming credit for a legacy that is objectively substantial. They contend that the Trump administration's aid cuts are a reallocation toward more strategic, results-oriented investments, not an abandonment of the continent. Highlighting past generosity, therefore, frames the current recalibration not as a withdrawal, but as an evolution of a long-standing partnership. The message is, we have been your most generous partner. As we change how we partner, remember that foundation. But wait, there's another side to this story. Critics, however, see this leaked directive as profoundly damaging, patronizing, and racially tinged. The immediate backlash from within diplomatic circles and African policy, experts labels the email's tone as dismissive and its content as counterproductive. Opponents counter that true generosity doesn't demand a receipt. They argue that publicly and aggressively demanding gratitude turns humanitarian action and strategic partnership into a transactional ledger, stripping it of its moral authority and goodwill. Diplomacy, they say, is built on subtlety and mutual respect, not on public reminders of who did whom a favor. This approach, critics warn, risks alienating the very partners the U.S. seeks to engage, making African leaders feel like children being scolded for ingratitude rather than sovereign nations in a partnership. More pointedly, many see a deep hypocrisy. The memo urges highlighting generosity, despite aid cuts. Critics pounce on this, arguing you cannot claim the mantle of a generous benefactor while actively reducing your benefaction. It's seen as wanting the prestige and influence of aid without paying the cost. They point to the tangible impacts, potential closures of USAID missions, reduced funding for life-saving health programs, and a pullback from multilateral climate initiatives that disproportionately affect Africa. To many on this side, the directive is a cynical PR move designed to mask a retreat, using the past accomplishments of previous administrations, of both parties, to gloss over the current administration's different priorities. Finally, and most damningly, critics connect this to a broader narrative they see in the Trump administration's Africa policy, a dismissal of the continent's strategic importance. The leaked email's broader context, they note, includes a dismissal of Africa as a priority, which has been labeled as racist by some insiders. This fuels a perception that the administration views Africa through a purely charitable or extractive lens, not as a continent of 54 dynamic nations, a growing economic force, and a crucial geopolitical player. For a country like Kenya, a major non-NATO ally hosting a significant U.S. military presence, such a tone from its top partner is unsettling and raises questions about the reliability and respect underpinning the relationship. So who's right? Let's look at the evidence. Stepping back from the heated rhetoric, what does the factual landscape tell us? The data suggests a complex picture where both sides are selectively highlighting truths. First, the historical generosity is not in dispute. The numbers are staggering. Since its 2003 inception, PEPFAR has invested over $100 billion in the global HIV/AIDS response, overwhelmingly in Africa. U.S. humanitarian assistance to Africa routinely totals billions annually. This has built immense institutional knowledge, deep people-to-people ties, and a reservoir of goodwill. Experts note that this legacy is a real form of American power, soft power, that the new directive seems to clumsily try to weaponize. However, the evidence of a shift is equally clear. While full 2026 budgets are still being debated, the trajectory under the Trump administration is toward consolidation and reduction of traditional development aid. Funding is being funneled into initiatives with clearer, America First, benefits, like counterterrorism cooperation, combating Chinese influence, and securing critical mineral supply chains. The proposed closure of certain USAID missions is a tangible signal of this pivot. Neutral analysts observing the Somalia election, for instance, see a concerning gap. The ambitious democratic transition requires sustained, patient investment in institution building, exactly the kind of long-term, non-transactional aid that is becoming harder to secure from Washington. International comparisons are revealing. As U.S. rhetoric and possibly resources pivot, other actors are not standing still. China's Belt and Road investments, despite concerns over debt, are visible and present. Turkish and Gulf state engagement in the Horn of Africa is growing. The evidence shows that the geopolitical space in Africa is highly competitive. An American strategy based primarily on invoking past deeds, rather than articulating a compelling vision for future cooperation, may struggle to compete. Experts on African governance argue that for ordinary Somalis voting in Mogadishu, the immediate concerns are security, jobs, and electricity, not diplomatic memos from Washington. The ultimate evidence of any policy's success will be on the ground, in the stability and prosperity of partners. The reality is more complex than either side fully admits. The uncomfortable truth is that both perspectives contain a hard kernel of reality the other side ignores. The Trump administration is correct that the scale of past U.S. aid is historically significant and that partnerships must evolve to reflect contemporary strategic interests. The era of assuming automatic, unqualified U.S. leadership is over, and a more explicit conversation about mutual benefits is, in principle, not unreasonable. However, the administration's fatal error, as revealed in this memo, is one of tone and execution. Reducing a decades-long, multifaceted relationship to a series of charitable transactions to be, aggressively, recalled is a profound misreading of diplomacy and human psychology. It mistakes leverage for loyalty. What most people miss is that this isn't just about aid dollars, it's about narrative and respect. The critics are right about the patronizing tone, but they sometimes underestimate the legitimate American frustration over a lack of strategic return on massive investment and the aggressive narrative competition from rivals like China. The synthesis is this: a recalibration of U.S. Africa policy is inevitable and perhaps necessary. But a successful recalibration requires framing the future, not invoicing the past. It requires treating African nations as the sovereign, capable actors they are, the very actors, like in Kenya, who are navigating their own complex relationships with multiple global powers. The memo's approach risks making the U.S. look insecure about its own value proposition, needing to shout about past glory rather than confidently articulating a shared future. So, how does this affect ordinary people? For a Kenyan trader relying on regional stability, a Somali entrepreneur hoping to attract investment, or a family dependent on cross-border health initiatives, this diplomatic friction translates into uncertainty. Aid cuts can mean fewer clinics, less support for farmers facing climate change, and reduced scholarships. The shift in tone can embolden other global powers, potentially reshaping the entire economic and political landscape of East Africa. For Kenya, a regional hub, this means carefully navigating a more multipolar world where its traditional ally is sending mixed signals. What to watch for next? First, see how this directive is implemented on the ground. Will U.S. ambassadors actually start making public speeches listing past American gifts? Second, observe the budget. The true test is whether the generosity framing a company's new, tangible investments or just covers for further retreat. Third, and most importantly, watch Africa's response. Nations like Kenya, with sophisticated diplomatic corps, will not be passive. They will diversify partnerships, strengthen regional blocs like the African Union, and engage with the U.S. from a position of their own growing agency, not as supplicants. So, we're left with a stark debate. Is the U.S. right to demand recognition for its past role as it changes course? Or is this a toxic strategy that undermines the very partnerships it needs? Now I want to hear from you. This is a deep issue for our region. Are you Team A, believing it's time for a more transactional, clear-eyed partnership? Or Team B, seeing this as a damaging and disrespectful misstep? Drop a comment below, 1 for Team A, 2 for Team B. Let's get a debate going. Share this with someone who needs to see both sides of this critical story for Africa's future. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for more breaking news.